The ground here is warm, not hot enough to feel through your shoes most of the time, but warm. In some places, snow melts before it can settle. Tomatoes used to grow in January. People thought the soil was just unusually fertile, blessed by something. They were wrong about what was blessing it. Underneath this town, 90 meters down, in a labyrinth of abandoned coal mines that nobody has worked since the 1950s, anthracite is burning. It has been burning since the day before Memorial Day, 1962. The temperature at the core is over 500 degrees Celsius. The fire covers 13 kilometers underground. There is no engineering solution. There is no plan. The state of Pennsylvania has stopped trying. There is a town here, or there was. Right now, in 2026, 5 people still live on top of it. In the next few minutes, 3 things. How a routine cleanup of a small-town garbage dump in 1962 became one of the longest burning fires in human history. Why the people who lived on top of it spent 19 years pretending it was not happening. And the moment, on Valentine's Day, 1981, when a 12-year-old boy fell into his grandmother's backyard and the entire United States finally noticed that an American town was being eaten from below. Centralia sits in Columbia County, in the anthracite coal belt of northeastern Pennsylvania. Anthracite is the densest, hardest, slowest burning kind of coal on Earth. The Buck Mountain seam runs underneath these hills in a network of tunnels that mining companies dug for over 100 years and then walked away from. By 1962, the mines were mostly closed. The big coal era was already over. Centralia had peaked in 1890 with a population of 2,761 people, 7 churches, 5 hotels, 27 saloons, 2 theaters, a bank, and 14 general stores. By the time the fire started, the population had dropped to roughly 1,500. People still mined a little, in independent operations called bootleg mines, drilling into the coal pillars left behind to support the ceilings of the abandoned shafts. Below the town, the coal seams were riddled with passages, vents, sealed entries, unsealed entries, and a few openings that nobody on the surface knew were still there. This detail matters. It is the detail that destroyed the town. On the 7th of May, 1962, the Centralia Borough Council met to discuss what the town was going to do about its garbage dump before Memorial Day. The dump was an abandoned strip mine pit on the edge of town, next to a cemetery. It was full. It smelled. They decided to do what they had always done. They decided to set it on fire. Subscribe to Impossible Lands, because what comes next is the exact moment a town discovered, by accident, that it had been burning underneath itself for 17 years. On the 27th of May, 1962, 5 members of the Centralia Volunteer Fire Company were paid by the Borough Council to clean out the landfill. They did what cleanup crews in Pennsylvania coal country had been doing for decades. They poured fuel, they lit it, they let the trash burn, they came back at night and hosed down the visible flames. 2 days later, on May 29th, the fire flared up again. They hosed it again. In early June, the flames came back. They hosed it again. There was a state law in Pennsylvania, passed in 1958, 4 years before any of this happened. That law specifically prohibited setting fire to landfills sited near abandoned mine workings. The reason was not abstract. Mine fires had happened before. Pennsylvania had 38 known active mining fires in the ground at any given time. Lighting a dump on top of a coal seam was, on paper, illegal. Centralia did it anyway, according to David DeCock, the journalist who has spent more than 4 decades documenting what happened. The council minutes describing the cleanup do not specify the method. They could not, because the method was illegal. Somewhere in the wall of that strip pit, behind the ash, behind the soot, was an unsealed opening into the abandoned tunnels of the Buck Mountain coal bed. Through that opening, the fire from the burning trash slipped into the mines. Once anthracite catches fire, it does not need oxygen the way ordinary fires do. It does not need fuel delivered to it. The coal seam is the fuel, and the fuel is everywhere, in every direction, for kilometers. By August of 1962, mine inspectors were detecting carbon monoxide levels, typical of a coal mine fire, deep below the town. On August 9th, all surface mines in the Centralia area were closed for safety. The fire was now underneath the houses, beneath the streets, beneath the cemeteries, and it was no longer reachable. For the next 20 years, the state of Pennsylvania and the federal government tried to put it out. They dug trenches. The trenches collapsed. They tried to flush the mines with crushed rock and water. The rock grinding equipment froze in a blizzard. They drilled boreholes and pumped slurry. The fire moved sideways and went around them. By the early 1980s, total spending on extinguishment efforts had reached approximately $7 million. According to one estimate that has been repeated by historians for decades, an additional $10,000 to $20,000 in 1962, applied at exactly the right place, in exactly the right month, might have ended it. Once the window closed, the fire was no longer something money could fix. And here is the first thing about Centralia almost no one outside it understood at the time. The town did not panic. The town adapted. For most of the 1960s, life in Centralia kept going. The fire was deep. It was slow. The smoke that came out of the ground was thin and intermittent. People noticed odd things. The grass in some yards stayed green into late November. Snow on certain sections of sidewalk melted before you could shovel it. Tomatoes grew in greenhouses with no heating because the floors were warm. Vegetable patches in some yards produced unseasonable harvests. A few residents joked that their land was blessed. A few children remembered, much later, that their parents would tell them not to play in certain spots, the way parents anywhere tell their kids not to play near a busy road. It was just one of the rules. It is hard, from the outside, to understand how a town can ignore the fact that a coal seam is burning underneath it for 15 years. From the inside, it was simpler than it looks. Centralia was a coal town. Coal was hard, dirty, dangerous work, and people who lived there had grown up around mine accidents, gas leaks, cave-ins, and the constant low-grade hazard of the industry that fed them. The smell of coal smoke in the air was the smell of a paycheck. By the early 1970s, paychecks were getting harder to come by. The big mines had closed. The young people were leaving. The town was already shrinking. The last thing the people who stayed wanted to hear was that the place where they were born, the houses that had been in their families for 3 or 4 generations, were sitting on a fuse. Then in 1979, the mayor of Centralia, a man named John Coddington, walked out to the underground fuel tanks at the gas station he owned. He needed to check the level of regular gasoline. He lowered a wooden dipstick into the tank, the way he had done every week for years. When he pulled the stick back out, it was warm. Warmer than it should be. He went back inside, found a thermometer, tied it to a length of string, and lowered it into the same tank. He let it sit. He pulled it back up. The gasoline in the tank was at 172 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 78 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to burn skin on contact. The fuel sitting in his tank was, in a slow and chemical way, on the verge of becoming dangerous. Coddington was not a scientist. He was the mayor of a small Pennsylvania mining town. He stared at the thermometer, and he understood for the first time what every Centralia resident had refused to understand for 17 years. The fire was not somewhere out there at the edge of town. The fire was directly underneath the gas station on the main street. This is the second thing about Centralia. The moment the town finally believed in its own catastrophe was not a scientific report. It was not a death. It was a man with a kitchen thermometer on a piece of string and gasoline that had quietly become hot enough to scald a hand. 2 years passed. Pennsylvania began to take the fire more seriously. Federal officials started touring the area. Engineering studies were commissioned. Most residents still wanted to stay. And then, on the 14th of February, 1981, Valentine's Day, Saturday morning, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski walked into his grandmother's backyard. He was looking for his cousin Eric, who was 14. Todd noticed a thin wisp of smoke coming up from the grass near a tree. He walked over to look. The ground gave way. Todd dropped straight down into a hole that had not existed 30 seconds before. The hole was approximately 4 feet wide. It was approximately 150 feet deep. The mud inside the hole was hot, slick, and slowly collapsing in on itself. Todd grabbed at a clump of tree roots sticking out of the side. The roots held. He hung there. The temperature inside the hole, measured later, was 350 degrees Fahrenheit. That is roughly 177 degrees Celsius. The carbon monoxide concentration coming up out of the hole was, according to subsequent measurements, lethal at the levels he was breathing. He had, by most estimates, less than a minute before he would have lost consciousness. His cousin Eric heard him scream. Eric ran. The first thing he saw was Todd's orange baseball cap floating on top of the steam. He reached down, locked his hands under Todd's arms, and pulled. Todd came up. The clay on his clothes had baked hard. The mud on his jeans had set into a kind of crust, fired by the heat, the way pottery is fired in a kiln. He was 12 years old. He had been in the ground for roughly 45 seconds. There happened to be a delegation of state and federal officials touring Centralia that exact morning, on that exact street, at that exact hour. They saw what had nearly happened. The story reached the New York Times within days. And here is the part of the story that almost nobody says out loud. By 1983, 2 years after Domboski's accident, the United States government commissioned a definitive engineering study on whether the Centralia fire could be put out. The answer was yes. It would require a massive trenching operation, cutting a fire break deep enough and wide enough to isolate the burning seam from the rest of the coal field. The estimated cost was approximately $660 million, with no guarantee of success. The federal government did the math. Then it did a different calculation. It calculated how much it would cost to buy out every property in the town and demolish every building. That figure was approximately $42 million. The decision was not technical, it was financial. Centralia was abandoned not because the fire was unstoppable, but because, by 1983, ending the town was 16 times cheaper than ending the fire. In 1983, Congress appropriated the $42 million. The relocation was technically voluntary. Most of Centralia's residents took the offer. They were given fair market value for their houses, slightly depreciated for the fire, and they moved. Many went to nearby Mount Carmel or Ashland. A few moved further. Some left the state entirely. The houses they left behind were demolished. By 1992, only a few dozen residents were still holding out. That year, Pennsylvania Governor Bob Casey invoked eminent domain on every property remaining inside the borough limits. Every house, every yard, every building. They were all condemned. The remaining residents legally became squatters in their own homes. They sued. They lost. In 2002, the United States Postal Service discontinued Centralia's zip code. The 5-digit number that had identified the town in the federal system since the early 20th century, 17927, was removed from the database. You could still live in Centralia. You could no longer receive mail addressed to it. The town existed physically. It stopped existing administratively. By 2009, only 11 homes were still standing. By 2013, the state and the 7 holdout residents reached a final settlement. The residents would be allowed to remain in their houses for the rest of their natural lives. After they died, the state would take possession of the property and demolish the structure. The contract did not say anything about what would happen to the fire underneath them. And so what is left of Centralia today, in 2026, is a strange thing to walk through. The street grid is intact. Sidewalks, curbs, fire hydrants, lamp posts, stop signs at intersections that have nothing to stop, public roads maintained by the state leading to empty lots overgrown with brush. There are addresses with no houses on them. There are blocks where you can still trace the outline of a porch in the grass. The Pennsylvania Department of Transportation still plows the roads in winter because legally they have to. There are 5 people left, plus the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church on a hilltop above the empty grid. White walls, blue and gold steeples. The last of the 5 churches that once served the town. It still holds services every week. The cars in the parking lot belong to the 5 remaining residents and a handful of worshippers who drive in from the surrounding boroughs. They walk in, they sit, they pray, and they walk out. Beneath their feet, in the labyrinth, the anthracite continues to burn at over 500 degrees Celsius. And there is one more thing that has to be said about Centralia, because it is the part the documentaries usually skip. Todd Domboski survived the fall on Valentine's Day, 1981. He grew up. He left Centralia. He carried the memory of those 45 seconds with him. Friends and family said in interviews that the dreams never stopped. The image of the orange baseball cap on the steam, the smell of the carbon monoxide, the feeling of the clay setting around his legs. He developed post-traumatic stress disorder. He was prescribed medication. On the 4th of February, 2022, almost 41 years to the day after he was pulled out of the ground, Todd Domboski died of a drug overdose. He was 52. The accident that saved Centralia by forcing the United States to finally pay attention to the fire underneath it also took its rescuer, slowly, over 4 decades. The town had been told, in the most literal way possible, what was happening underneath it. The cost of finally hearing that message was paid by a 12-year-old boy in his grandmother's backyard, and then it kept being paid by him for the rest of his life. There is a sentence the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection puts in its official briefings about the Centralia mine fire. The estimated remaining duration of the burn, given current geology and the volume of unburned anthracite still inside the seam, is somewhere between 200 and 250 more years. Centralia was a coal town for 100 years. It is going to be a fire for 300. The 5 residents who signed the agreement in 2013 are aging. When the last of them dies, the state will take the last houses. The street grid will remain. The church on the hill will keep holding services for as long as anyone is willing to drive up to it. The anthracite will keep burning at 500 degrees Celsius, 90 meters underground, in a labyrinth nobody has worked since the Eisenhower administration. The fire does not know that the town is gone. The fire does not know that the people are gone. The fire does not know anything. It is just the slow, geological consequence of one decision, made on a Sunday in May of 1962, by men who were trying to clean up a garbage dump before a parade. So here is the thing to think about after this video ends. The people of Centralia did not lose their town all at once. They lost it slowly, over 20 years, while telling themselves that the warm sidewalks and the unseasonable tomatoes were just an oddity. By the time the ground opened up under a child, the catastrophe had already been there for almost 2 decades. There is something about the human capacity to accommodate a slow disaster, to keep putting away the dishes, to keep going to church on the hill, to keep walking the dog, even when something is burning beneath everything you love. Centralia is the literal version of that. Most disasters are the metaphorical version. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I will see you on Impossible Lands.